Here is a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. What is consciousness? Not what it does. Not where it lives in the brain. Not what happens to it under anesthesia, or in dreamless sleep, or during cardiac arrest. What is it? The subjective experience of being you. The inner light. The thing that makes reading these words feel like something rather than just processing information in the dark. What is that? Neuroscience has been working on this question seriously for over a century. Philosophy of mind has been working on it for millennia. Quantum physics has been circling it for nearly 100 years. And here is the honest answer that most popular science communication will not give you directly. We don't know. Not, we have most of it and are filling in the gaps. Not, we have the outline and need the details. We genuinely don't know what consciousness is. We know a great deal about what correlates with it, what brain regions are active when specific conscious experiences occur, what happens to consciousness when specific systems are damaged, what chemical interventions alter conscious experience in predictable ways. But the thing itself, the actual nature of subjective experience, why physical processes give rise to an interior at all, that remains, in the words of the philosopher who named it most precisely, the hard problem. And the hard problem is harder than most people have been told. This video is about what we actually know, what we don't know, and why the gap between those two things matters more than almost anything else in the contemporary conversation about mind, reality, and what it means to be human. Let me be precise about what neuroscience has genuinely established about consciousness, because it's significant, and because the significant findings are different from what the popular narrative usually presents. What neuroscience has established: neural correlates of consciousness exist. When you have a specific conscious experience, seeing red, feeling pain, recognizing a face, specific patterns of neural activity occur. These correlates are real, reproducible, and increasingly well mapped. Brain damage produces predictable consciousness changes. Damage to the visual cortex and specific visual capacities disappear. Damage to the hippocampus and specific memory functions are lost. Damage to the prefrontal cortex and specific executive functions are altered. The relationship between brain structure and conscious function is real and operationally significant. Anesthesia suppresses consciousness through chemical intervention. The mechanisms are increasingly understood. General anesthesia disrupts the integrated information processing that appears to be necessary for conscious experience at the level we normally inhabit. Psychoactive substances alter conscious experience through specific receptor interactions. The mechanisms are real and increasingly well mapped. Sleep stages produce different qualities of conscious experience through identifiable neural mechanisms. REM sleep and its relationship to dreaming is substantially understood at the neural level. This is genuine, significant, hard-won scientific knowledge. It establishes beyond reasonable doubt that consciousness and brain function are closely related. That relationship is real. What neuroscience has not established, the mechanism by which any of this produces subjective experience. The neural correlates of consciousness tell us what happens in the brain when consciousness occurs. They do not tell us why those brain events are accompanied by experience at all. The brain damage findings tell us that specific brain regions are necessary for specific conscious capacities. They do not tell us that the brain is sufficient to produce consciousness, that consciousness is nothing more than what the brain does. Necessary and sufficient are different claims. A piano is necessary for piano music in the normal case. But the piano doesn't produce the music independently. It requires a pianist. The fact that damaging the piano damages the music doesn't establish that the piano is the source of the music. This is not a trivial distinction. It is the distinction that the entire consciousness debate turns on. And neuroscience, despite its genuine achievements, has not closed it. I want to spend time on the necessary versus sufficient distinction because it's the conceptual hinge that most popular consciousness discussion either misses or deliberately obscures. Here is the distinction stated plainly. A cause is necessary for an effect if the effect cannot occur without the cause. A cause is sufficient for an effect if the cause alone is enough to produce the effect. Oxygen is necessary for fire. Remove the oxygen and the fire goes out. But oxygen alone is not sufficient for fire. You also need fuel and heat. The presence of oxygen doesn't explain the fire. It's a required condition, not the complete explanation. Now apply this to consciousness and the brain. The neuroscientific evidence establishes that certain brain functions are necessary for certain conscious capacities. Remove those functions, and those capacities disappear. What it does not establish is that brain function is sufficient for consciousness. That consciousness is nothing more than what brain activity produces. That when brain activity stops, consciousness necessarily stops with it. The popular narrative assumes the sufficient claim. It presents consciousness as identical to brain activity, as what the brain does, full stop. As if establishing the necessary relationship automatically established the sufficient one. It doesn't. And this matters enormously for the question of consciousness and death. If brain activity is only necessary for consciousness, if consciousness uses the brain as an instrument rather than being produced by it, then the cessation of brain activity is not automatically the cessation of consciousness. It is the removal of a necessary instrument. What happens after that removal is a different question. One the neuroscientific evidence doesn't answer. I want to be honest about something personal here. When the physicians reviewed my case after the coma, when they encountered the account of their own conversations recalled from the unconscious state, the framework most of them were working within had no category for what I was describing. Not because the account was implausible, because the framework assumed the sufficient claim without having established it. Consciousness equals brain activity. Brain activity stops, therefore consciousness stops. But that's not what happened. The brain activity had stopped in every measurable sense, and something was still there. The necessary versus sufficient distinction gives that something a theoretical home. The hard problem in full depth. In 1995, the philosopher David Chalmers published a paper that permanently changed the consciousness debate. The paper was called Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness. In it, Chalmers made a distinction that is simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to resolve. He distinguished between what he called the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. The easy problems, and again, easy doesn't mean simple, it means tractable, are questions about the functions of consciousness. How does the brain integrate information? How does it direct attention? How does it distinguish sleeping from waking? How does it control behavior? These are genuinely difficult scientific questions, but they are questions about mechanism and function. In principle, given enough time and resources, science can answer them. They are the right kind of question for science to answer. The hard problem is different in kind. The hard problem asks, why is any of this accompanied by experience? Why is there something it is like to see red? something it is like to feel pain, something it is like to hear music. Why isn't the brain's processing of all this information happening in the dark, efficiently, mechanically, producing all the same functional outputs, without any inner experience accompanying it? What Chalmers established, and what the subsequent 30 years of philosophy of mind have largely confirmed, is that no solution to the easy problems automatically solves the hard problem. You can give a complete account of how the brain processes visual information and still not explain why that processing is accompanied by the experience of seeing. You can give a complete account of how the brain integrates signals from the body and still not explain why that integration is accompanied by the feeling of pain. The explanation of mechanism leaves out the explanation of experience. And this is not a gap that more neuroscience will automatically close. Because neuroscience is the science of mechanism, it gives accounts of what happens and how. The hard problem asks why any of it is experienced at all. That is a different kind of question. The philosopher Thomas Nagel made this argument in a different register in his famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? He pointed out that you could know every physical fact about a bat's echolocation system, every neural pathway, every frequency response, every behavioral output, and still not know what it is like to be a bat experiencing that echolocation. The subjective dimension is left out by the physical description entirely. Not partially described, not approximately captured, left out. That is the hard problem, and it matters for the consciousness survival question because it means this. The materialist framework, the framework that says consciousness is produced by the brain and ends when the brain stops, has no explanation for why there is consciousness at all. A framework that cannot explain the existence of the thing it claims to have accounted for is not a settled framework. It is a framework with a hole in it the size of everything that matters. The quantum disruption. While philosophy of mind was developing the hard problem argument, a parallel disruption was occurring inside physics itself. Quantum mechanics, established through a century of rigorous experimental work, has produced findings about the nature of physical reality that the materialist account of consciousness has never fully absorbed. Let me state the central finding as precisely as I can. At the subatomic level, the level of electrons, photons, and quarks, physical reality does not behave the way classical physics assumed it behaved. Particles don't have fixed, definite states until they are observed. They exist in superposition, multiple possible states simultaneously, until a measurement is made. The act of measurement collapses the superposition into a single, definite outcome. This is not a theoretical interpretation. This is the experimental result. The double-slit experiment has been reproduced thousands of times in laboratories around the world. A particle fired at a barrier with two slits behaves like a wave when not observed, passing through both slits simultaneously and creating an interference pattern. When you observe which slit the particle passes through, the interference pattern disappears. The particle behaves like a particle. The observation changes the physical outcome. Now here is the implication that the materialist framework has never satisfactorily addressed. If observation participates in producing physical reality at the quantum level, if the observer and the observed are not fully separable at the most fundamental level of physical description, then the picture of consciousness as a passive product of a physical world that exists independently of it becomes very difficult to maintain. John von Neumann made this argument mathematically in 1932. The chain of physical causation, he demonstrated, cannot account for the collapse of the wave function without invoking a non-physical observer at the end of the chain. Eugene Wigner extended this to consciousness explicitly. The only satisfactory resolution of the measurement problem, he wrote, involves recognizing that consciousness is not produced by physical processes, but is itself fundamental to reality. These are not mystical claims. These are rigorous mathematical arguments by some of the most precise minds in the history of physics. More recently, Roger Penrose, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020, has argued that consciousness cannot be accounted for by classical computation, and has proposed with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff that consciousness arises from quantum processes at the level of microtubules within neurons. The OR theory, orchestrated objective reduction, remains controversial. What it represents is significant, regardless of whether its specific claims are ultimately validated. It represents the serious, mathematically rigorous attempt by Nobel-level physicists to locate consciousness at the quantum substrate rather than at the classical computational level. And if consciousness has a quantum substrate, if it is in some meaningful sense quantum information, then the principle of unitarity applies. Quantum information is conserved, not sustained by a particular physical system. Conserved, transformed when the system changes, not destroyed when the system stops. What happened during my 3 months in a coma was not, in this framework, the cessation of consciousness. It was consciousness continuing in the absence of the classical neural hardware that normally supports its expression in ordinary waking life. The quantum framework gives that a theoretical home the classical materialist framework cannot provide. The personal anchor. I want to bring this back to something concrete. Because the hard problem and quantum mechanics and the necessary versus sufficient distinction are genuinely important arguments, but they can remain abstract, interesting intellectual territory that doesn't quite land in the body. Let me land it in the body of a 7-year-old in a coma for 3 months. The materialist framework. Consciousness is produced by the brain. Brain activity stops. Consciousness stops. Predicts one thing about my 3 months. Nothing. No experience. No awareness. No perception. No processing of the environment. The coma was not sleep. It was not the dreamless dark of deep sleep. It was, by the materialist framework's own accounting, the complete cessation of the conditions necessary and sufficient for consciousness. That's what the framework predicts. That's not what happened. What happened was that I could hear the physicians, their conversations, their clinical discussions, their words to each other about my condition. And when I came back, when the 3 months ended and the body began responding again, those conversations came back with me. The hard problem says we can't explain why physical processes produce experience at all. But my 3 months suggests something more specific than the hard problem's general puzzle. Not just that experience accompanies physical processes in ways we can't explain. That experience can persist in the apparent absence of the physical processes that the materialist framework says are required to produce it. That is a different and more specific claim. The neuroscientific evidence says brain function is necessary for normal, conscious experience. My 3 months says that what we've been calling necessary may in fact be instrumental. The brain as the instrument through which consciousness expresses in ordinary conditions, not as the source of consciousness itself. Remove the instrument and the expression changes. The thing being expressed doesn't stop. This is not me interpreting my experience through a framework I adopted later. This is the framework I've spent 54 years building, because nothing else was adequate to contain what I came back knowing. Where the science stops and why I want to be honest about why the science stops where it stops, because I don't think it's primarily an intellectual limitation. I think it's an institutional one. The materialist framework is not just a scientific hypothesis. It is the operating assumption of modern medicine, modern psychology, modern psychiatry, and significant portions of modern philosophy. A vast infrastructure of practice, training, funding, and professional identity is built on top of it. If consciousness is fundamental rather than produced, if it uses the brain as an instrument rather than being generated by it, the implications cascade through every one of those institutions in ways that are genuinely disruptive. Medicine would need to account for the consciousness of patients in states currently assumed to be unconscious. The implications for end-of-life care alone are significant. Psychology and psychiatry would need to revise their fundamental account of what the mind is and what it means to heal it. The entire framework for understanding human development, human suffering, and human flourishing would need to be rebuilt from a different foundation. That's not a small ask. Institutions don't make those adjustments easily or quickly, regardless of what the evidence suggests. And so the science stops at a specific threshold, not because the evidence beyond the threshold is weak, because crossing the threshold is institutionally costly in ways that the evidence alone cannot override. The honest scientist's position on consciousness is not certainty in either direction. It is this: we have established that brain function and conscious experience are closely related. We have not established the nature of that relationship with the precision required to make confident claims about what happens to consciousness when the brain stops. The hard problem remains unsolved. The quantum implications remain unresolved. The NDE evidence, 50 years of peer-reviewed documentation, remains unexplained by conventional mechanisms. And the account of a 7-year-old who spent 3 months in a coma and came back with conversations that occurred during that period, that account is sitting in the literature, waiting for a framework large enough to hold it. This series is that framework. Let's close. Let me close with what I want you to take from this video. Not a conclusion, a precision. The popular narrative about consciousness and science says, science has established that consciousness is a product of the brain and ends at death. That narrative is not accurate. What science has established is that brain function and conscious experience are closely related. That specific brain structures are necessary for specific conscious capacities. That altering brain chemistry alters conscious experience. What science has not established is that the brain is sufficient for consciousness. That consciousness is nothing more than what the brain produces. That the cessation of brain activity necessarily means the cessation of consciousness. Those are the claims the popular narrative makes as if they were established. They are not established. The hard problem, why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all, remains genuinely open after 30 years of serious philosophical work. The quantum implications, what the observer dependence of quantum reality means for the relationship between consciousness and the physical world, remain genuinely unresolved. And the evidence from 50 years of NDE research, from the accounts of people who were clinically dead and came back with verifiable perceptions from the period of clinical death, from the 3 months of a 7-year-old whose consciousness was somewhere the instruments couldn't measure. That evidence is sitting in the peer-reviewed literature. unexplained by the framework that claims to have explained it. What I'm offering in this series is not a replacement framework that claims to have all the answers. I am offering the honest accounting that the popular narrative refuses to give. The science doesn't tell us consciousness ends at death. The science tells us it doesn't know. And there is a significant difference between those two positions. One closes the question, the other opens it. This series lives in the opening. Next in this series, the NDE evidence in full depth, 50 years of peer-reviewed research, the specific cases that resist conventional explanation, the researchers who followed the data wherever it led, and what all of it means when the person discussing it spent 3 months inside the data at age 7. Link above. Take care of yourself.